Just got done watching the recent discussion between Matthieu Pageau and Jordan Peterson on Jordan Peterson's podcast, and I was delighted to see Matthieu and him talking about his work on such a big platform. And I took some notes on some of the sections of the discussion. It was about 2 hours long. I highly recommend checking it out. And I want to just reflect back on my notes and kind of speak to what comes up as I look through what I jotted down here. Some of the titles I was thinking about for this video were Matthieu Pageau and Jordan Peterson, The Bible and the Fractal Superstructure of Being. Another subtitle or title that came to mind, Discerning the Divine Plan for Man and World. The Divine Blueprint for Man's Comportment and Proper Place Between Heaven and Earth. The Source Code of Man's Relation to Self, Other, and World. Proving the truth of the structure and function of biblical narrative. We are here to mediate between heaven and earth and bring forth the kingdom. Bible as blueprint for civilization building. And some more notes I jotted down is that the Bible is also a blueprint for anti-fascism. These sound like grandiose titles here, but I made him this way to reflect on the position that Matthieu Pageau takes with his book, The Language of Creation. It was published in 2018, and it's written in a very straightforward, almost like engineering type format. And where Pageau is coming from is he's distilling the biblical stories, the biblical narratives to first principles, and then discerning the pattern that is reflected and refracted throughout the Bible, and how this pattern plays itself out not only within the biblical narratives but also within our lives. So it is the very Rosetta Stone for human relationships between self, other, and world. It really is. And you don't have to be dogmatic about this if you can do the work and see the language that Matthieu Pageau is reflecting on here, and you can actually learn the language of symbolism, and then you can apply it to the stories and into your life yourself, and then you can validate or verify if these stories are coherent, or if this method is coherent in observing phenomenon especially at different scales. The main kind of point here, and the point of the book, is about the fractal nature of reality, and how at bottom what man is to do here on earth is mediate between meaning and matter, between heaven and earth, between the masculine and the feminine, and in doing so structuring and ordering relations on the planet, on earth, where flourishing and well-being happens, not just for man and woman, but also for the animals and the plants, and the kingdom is essentially, right? So it seems grandiose, but I think we're going to take a stab at it here and look at the discussion probably around 30 minutes in, where they started talking about Adam and Eve. And I jotted down here relationship between Adam and Eve, the standard model of human relations, right? You have the standard model of particle physics, right? This is the standard model for human relations. And it's not just about, again, how humans are to treat each other, where it is, but it fractally scales to all levels, essentially, right? So how does man deal with woman, neighbor, other, friend, right? But also, what is man's proper place in relationship to institutions, to government, to civilizations? What's the proper place of the individual with regards to the collective? I think all of these major questions that we're all forced to contend with today are really effectuated in the story of Adam and Eve quite beautifully. And again, use the language, the symbolic language here, and apply it yourself, and you can see if it's something that resonates or is coherent. And I'd love to hear critiques or how you find this information if you're new to it, and what you kind of think of it. But we'll get started here. So the story of Adam and Eve, quickly, I've made some videos discussing this in some depth, but is ultimately the creation story of human civilization. And Adam was created by God to be his divine arbiter of building the kingdom on earth, right? So man is the mediator of heaven and earth, right? And the term Adam and Eve, right? The term Adam is a fractal term, right? It means the individual, but it also means humanity as a whole. The actual term Adam in Hebrew means humanity, right? The term Eve reflects the individual Eve, but also is fractally scales up to life. So Adam, humanity, life, or Eve, life. So it's the proper relationship between humanity and life, right? Is what is at the core here of the relationship between Adam and Eve. And if you remember from the biblical story that Adam was put to sleep by God, and while he was asleep, Eve was taken from his body and created. And Eve is just as important, is completely just as important as Adam in this story and in the world, right? Because again, this is a fractal pattern of reality and how it lays itself out. So what is Eve's relationship with regards to Adam? So Adam's job is to name the animals, right? So this is the idea of imposing meaning on things, right? That is definitely one of man's, what man is to do on this earth is to impose meaning on matter, on nature, on the earth, and doing so create civilization. Eve is brought to oppose Adam like a mirror, not in an adversarial way, but as we see that the adversarial path is easy and is kind of what has taken hold, right? So Eve, opposite of Adam, is meant to be a mirror, is meant to reflect Adam, the identity of Adam to Adam, because he cannot do it himself. He is naming the animals, right? So Eve is there to reflect the identity of both Adam and Eve back into Adam, and is supposed to play a role of an adversary that loves, right? So this can be thought of in terms of a marriage, right? A marriage, to contend with a lifelong relationship with someone in holy matrimony and being married, it's not easy. It's a very difficult thing, because a lot of times the one partner will reflect back the sins or the challenges or the character defects that the other partner has, and this happens naturally. This is not and if it's done without maliciousness, it's the appropriate way for the feedback loop of a marriage to nurture and grow both individuals into something greater, something bigger. That is the whole idea there, right? So if Adam is to name the animals, impose meaning on the animals, what is Eve's job? So Eve is to listen to the animals, right? This is what Matthieu Pageau was talking with Jordan about around the 30-minute mark, if you want to check it out. And the question that Matthieu posed, and I think is relevant here, is how can Eve understand the animals? How can Eve understand the snake? Now, all of a sudden, we have a talking snake in the Garden of Eden. And for some reason, Eve can hear the snake, right, and listens to the snake. So Eve's role is more closely aligned with multiplicity, with matter, with the earth, with the material realm, and is supposed to be a mediator between the material realm, the earthly realm, and the heavenly realm, and in terms with relationships and with relationship with Adam, right? Again, you got to think fractally here. So Eve's role with Adam is to reflect back the meaning-making process that he undergoes, right? So humanity as a whole imposes meaning on the earth. It is Eve's job to be a feedback mechanism to Adam to correctly and appropriately fix the behavior, the meaning-making, the imposition of order towards the highest ideal for all involved, right? And why I said this is an anti-fascist system is, fascism is when the imposition of order goes out of whack, when there is no listening to the marginalized, there's no acceptance of any feedback, and in doing so, the tyranny opposes itself. We can think of this as the worst parts of what's called the patriarchy, or the tyrannical father, or the stifling society, or something like fascism that was going on in Italy and in Germany, right? So there needs to be a respect and a consideration for the marginalized, for the foreign, for the particular, in order for the system of civilization building and human relations to flourish appropriately. So that's a general idea of Eve's role with regards to that. So the snake tricks Eve, right? The fall was instantiated by Eve believing the snake, which tricks Eve and Adam into a false sense of mastery, right? A false sense of mastery. What does a false sense of mastery mean in this context here? If you remember from the story, God said to Adam and Eve, you can eat from any tree or any plant in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eve was tricked into eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is the imposition of pride, right? Because the appropriation of good and evil from the level where Adam and Eve were at, right? The idea is they were to spiritually mature and eventually actually eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil when they had the appropriate spiritual maturation in order to discern good and evil and appropriately build from there. But what happened was, in the fall, Adam and Eve ate from this tree where they got information that they were not able to integrate, but they were under the false illusion or the sense of being able to integrate all information. And in doing so, pride and this narcissism, where man became the measure of all things without any ties to communing with God or anything higher. So the ultimate arbiter of truth, love, beauty, and well-being on the earth was man and man alone. And that was a result of this taking on of the knowledge of good and evil without the spiritual maturity, right? So more on Eve's role. Eve's role is to listen to the marginalized, right? We can think of this, again, from Adam and Eve, from the masculine and the feminine, but you can also think of it in the political terms of left and right, right? So the right is more reflective of Adam's position in the world, and the left is more reflective of Eve's position. And the point made here is this relationship between the left and the right is extremely important in building civilization, building community, and building worlds, essentially, right? So Adam is more, again, reflective of the right wing, Eve more of the left wing. So the ecological movement can be thought of responsibility of Eve. So Eve is to listen to the marginalized. The left's role is to listen to the marginalized in the community, in the nation, wherever it may be, even in the home, right? You can think of this as the kids. You can think of it in terms of citizens, right? So listen to the marginalized and pose the right question to Adam to transform and renew the system, right? So in Matthieu Pageau's book, the role of the earth is like a riddle. The role of Eve is to pose a riddle to Adam in order for him to answer it, and in the process transforming both Adam and Eve and the world to a higher level, to a closer pattern with the kingdom of heaven, so to speak. So the left's role, Eve's role, is to listen to the marginalized, the outcast, all right, and pose the right question to Adam to transform and renew the system. If that's done appropriately, you can have a system of continuous renewal. But when there is sin, right, Adam and Eve fell into sin. And the term sin means to miss the mark, right? So there is the sin of the right, the sin of Adam, and there is the sin of the left, the sin of Eve, right? So the sin of Adam, the right wing, when the right wing goes too far, it's fascism. It's an imposition of order. It's a forced imposition of meaning, right? So Eve is there, the left is there to influence the system so it doesn't become tyrannical in this sin of the right hand, right? Whereas the sin of the left wing, right, the sin of Eve, is the you can kind of think of it, I think they didn't say it like this, is the sin of communism, right? It's the sin of a hyper focus on the marginalized to the detriment of the system as a whole. He even says, so Eve is like, Pageau says, Eve is like the curse that loves you, the curse that loves you, the adversary that loves you. And if the relationship isn't appropriately mediated, Eve becomes the curse that kills you. It becomes the enemy within. And there's a lot of stories in the Bible are talking about this protection or this consideration made between the foreigner and the nation or the state or the people. There's a appropriate way that a people is related to the foreigner or the marginalized within the system. And if that's not done appropriately, the system will be overthrown, will be destroyed, and will decompose and disintegrate. Another interesting reflection Pageau puts forth is Newton versus Einstein to reflect this idea of Eve being a mirror, but it being of adversary that doesn't destroy but transforms, right? So Newton had a system of science which was very practical and very accurate and very functional. Einstein in this relationship here plays the role of Eve, right? Plays the role of the mirror, putting the mirror up towards Newton's system, right? And showing him that he is not putting himself in the system. He is not considering himself in the system. So Einstein, with his theory of relativity, reflects back to Newton to properly place Newtonian physics within this matrix, right? So Einsteinian physics did not come and destroy Newtonian physics, right? It made it better. It transformed it, right? And I think it's an important distinction to think here. What is the appropriate role of the left, or the appropriate role of the critic is not to critique for the sake of critique or for the sake of destruction, but to do it for the sake of transformation and renewal. I think that's the key distinction when we're talking about something like building a civilization, is that these considerations need to be made and proportionality needs to be respected with regards to the mediation between the identity and the people of a nation, let's say, and the relationship with the border and with the foreigner is really important here. So the way that Newtonian physics and Einsteinian physics, Einstein didn't come destroy Newton, but put him in a place of a higher order. And the way he did that is by reflecting back the self-recursive fractal pattern that is embedded in nature itself. All right. So the theory of relativity kind of related back Newtonian physics to Newton himself, and now we're talking a lot about of keeping the scientist within his scientific theory is understanding the relationship between the scientist and the theory that he proposes, which I think this gives us some insight here on how to reflect on that. So the sins of the right look like a system closing in on itself. So Newton had a closed system, and the left's job is to open the system, allow the new, the novel to come in and ultimately renew the system as a whole, right? So the idea is that the idea is to transcend and include the system, not to efface the system, right? Another reflection that is discussed is the idea of a little death that avoids the big death, right? Listening to the marginalized and then posing a question to Adam in order to make those complaints or grievances known in the right way is like showing that the system isn't working and here's why. And in doing so, it makes those that have the power to reorient themselves through policy or institutions or whatever it may be to keep the system healthy and balanced. So this is all about enacting and keeping the balance with regards to civilization building and human relationships. So Adam, the sin of the right, we have fascism. Eve, the sin of the left, we have communism. I don't know if that's the right word there. Maybe anarchy. So the idea of having a adversary that loves you, having an adversary that hates you. So with reflecting on this idea, so Eve poses a riddle to Adam to solve in order to transcend and include the current situation. The sin of the left would be giving an Adam a riddle that cannot be solved. Giving Adam a riddle that cannot be solved. In a sense, throwing a wrench into the system where eventually the system as a whole comes down because problems are being posed in bad faith without particular solutions in mind. So to miss the mark to sin is not to aim appropriately in this relationship as well. And next, I want to touch on a little bit the section in the conversation talking about the tetramorphic cherub. So the cherub, which is this angel with specific features. So the features are a human in the middle, a lion to the right, and bull to the left, and an eagle to the right. So humans in the center, we have lion, bull, and we have the eagle, right? And just as a little bit of an aside here, I compared that to Heidegger's fourfold, his Gewurt, where you have human Dasein in the middle, and you have the sky up top, and then the gods, the mortals on the right and the left, and then earth at the bottom. I think there's a homologous relationship between the tetramorphic cherubs and Heidegger's fourfold, and it's the very structure of being itself that is being outlined here, I would put forth. Right. So the structure of being is tetramorphic, and the appropriate mediation between these symbolic categories made up of these four distinct natures, the appropriate mediation of the four in the center by the human is the goal, right? Is what is to be aimed for. Sorry about that. I keep getting interrupted here with these little cuts. And I kind of lost my train of thought, but we're talking about the tetramorph, right? And I wanted to think about the fourfold of Heidegger as well, right? So, and the relationship between the two. So in the cherub, you have the eagle at the top, and in the fourfold, you have the sky up at the top. And these terms both reflect meaning. They both reflect the abstract, the heavenly realm, whereas the bottom represents the earth, multiplicity, the particular in the material realm, right? So in mediating appropriately between heaven and earth, it is the human being's job to interlock and to concretize the abstract and to abstract the concrete appropriately, which I know sounds like a mouthful there, right? So one of the main functions of humanity is to mediate between meaning and matter, between unity and multiplicity. And this is reflected by the eagle in the tetramorph of the cherub and the sky in Heidegger's fourfold. In Heidegger's fourfold, you also have the gods on the right and the mortals on the left, right? So the gods reflect infinity and immortality, right? And the mortals reflect finitude. So not only do we have to mediate meaning and matter, but we have to mediate infinity and finitude. And in doing so, those are the four structures of civilization building are the mediation between meaning and matter, between unity and multiplicity, and between the infinite and the finite. And human beings find themselves at the center of this fourfold system, of this tetramorph. And this idea, this symbolism can inform us so much on how to go about living our lives individually, but also collectively, politically, historically, and across the board. There's just a depth to these symbols and these ideas and this content that is just it needs to be explored more. And I'm glad that to see this conversation happen. A couple more things I want to touch on here before I close it out. They talk about the flaming, the cherub, the angel that is put at the gate of the Garden of Eden with a flaming sword, right? And the reason that the cherub is there is to protect the kingdom from, or to protect Adam and Eve from accessing the Garden of Eden before their time, just like they accessed the tree of the knowledge of good and evil too early. The return to Eden has to go through this cherub with a flaming sword. And a cherub is a hybrid being made up of these different animals: a bull, a human, a lion, and an eagle, right? So in a sense, it's a confusion of identities. And if Adam's job is to name the animals, this confusion of identities is the fallen nature of Adam's job, is the Yes, the fallen nature of Adam's proclivity and ability to name animals. So this confusion happens, right? But what about the flaming sword? So the flaming sword, Pageau talks about it as the logos, right? It is discerning. It separates the wheat from the chaff. It is that which will return the process to normal and to order when the time is right, right? So the flaming sword, the way that the language, according to Pageau in Hebrew, says is a sword that turns on itself. The flaming sword that turns on itself. This made me think, I wrote here in my notes, is this the structure of kenosis, right? This idea of crucifying the intellect. This idea that Adam and humanity, right? Humanity's ability to discern and name the animals, to impose meaning on the world, has been confused. And the first sin, the biggest sin of the fall, is pride, right? So again, it goes back to this idea of man being the measure of all things with nothing above him to aim at, essentially, right? Except for the void or for space or whatnot. So this function and structure of meaning, the sky in Heidegger's fourfold and the eagle and the cherub, is not appropriately being mediated, and in doing so, confusion ensues. Another note that I wrote here that Pageau said, and I think it encompasses the whole talk beautifully, says, is the need to find a foreign perspective to renew oneself. So the biblical narratives, one of the main functions of the biblical narratives is to show stories that disclose the idea of the need to find a foreign perspective to renew oneself. This, you think of this as an individual who is stubborn, that needs novel information in order to kind of renew himself, herself, but also a nation state and an organization, a company, a football team, a sports team, right? This need to find a foreign perspective to renew itself, right? You have to continuously draft new people, right? You have to, if you're a nation and you close your borders completely, you will stifle and degenerate, right? So you need to focus on the appropriate mediation of the foreigner within the system. And it needs to be done in a way where there's a continual transformation. If that's not done in good faith, if it's done from the perspective of the sin of the left, where it's a curse that wants to kill rather than a curse that wants to, that loves you, all right, that will lead to rapid destruction and disintegration. And I think Jordan Peterson and both Matthieu Pageau are warning that is kind of the space and the place that we're in right now. And I think that's why these ideas are being explored more and more. Because they're necessary. Another section of the discussion was talking about the fractal nature of reality and thinking with recursion. How you have to learn to think this way, and I think that Pageau's book does a great job of doing that for you. If you really struggle with it, and it'll open your eyes to see this way. It won't make you dogmatically believe anything, but you can discern the pattern that's being reflected in the book, and you can apply it yourself to both the biblical stories and to relationships in your own life. And that this way of discerning the truth works the way you can verify or see if it's coherent or valid as it works. The pattern is discerned at multiple levels of analysis, again, fractally. Again, in the conversation later, we talk about competition, and I really love this section, right? Because I put here in my notes, right, put competition in its proper place. So cooperation transcends competition, but it doesn't exclude competition. It transforms and renews competition to something like games, right? Play, football, basketball, soccer, whatever you may think of. If the system is ordered appropriately, you can have constrained competition that usually is for selective purposes, right? To select the most competent in whatever domain we want to bring in as an example. But this idea of competition put in its proper place is also a reflection of several biblical themes, according to Pageau, and I think he's right from at least where I see here. So they also talk about these two cycles, right? There's an outer cycle, which is war, and there's an inner cycle, which is, again, this contained competition. If this system's degenerating, then the competition will be pathological, right, and will lead to war, as opposed to if the system is working coherently, heaven and earth are being mediated appropriately, the citizen and the foreigner are being mediated appropriately, these structures are in place, the fourfold is being disclosed appropriately, then the competition is healthy and in a way that supports the system as a whole. Whereas if it is degenerating, the competition becomes this pathological, pit of vipers, and you can reflect yourself to see where we're at right now here in 2022. So again, cooperation transcends but includes competition and transforms it. Some more notes I wrote. Eve selects for war or play, right? So the left's role, the feminine role, is act as a selecting mechanism for play, that is if it's the adversary that loves you, or for war if it's the adversary that hates you, in a sense. So the feminine principle is just as important as the masculine principle. Eve is just as important as Adam. They are one, and their functions and their roles are extremely important in understanding of how we should treat each other and how we should act with our institutions in the world. Really, so this applies to so many levels that if it's worth doing the time to learn this way of seeing and to apply it kind of yourself as well. There was also a good at the end a section where they were talking about Jacob and Esau and the problems inherent in the firstborn, right? The firstborn, and I won't go into this too much, I'll kind of leave it here. The idea is the firstborn gets the inheritance. So the firstborn inherits the wealth and the land, but also inherits the problems. And in doing so, is not given the time that is given to the secondborn in order to process and actually contend with the problems at hand. And again, remember the central theme of the fall is this false sense of mastery, of self-mastery. The idea is to be able to, with humility, integrate the novel and integrate information into the society without destroying it, without bringing too much in too fast. Right. So again, it all works with this process of mediation. But I'm going to leave it there. I wanted to keep this around 30 minutes, and I think we're right there. But let me know what you guys think. Please check out this discussion if this interests you, and I will see you guys on the next video. Thanks. Bye.